Well,
I don't know. Okay,
Zoom will
so
decide.
we're good. We are in a good energy right now. And so the first, I guess I have to I don't feel like I have to introduce the podcast or anything, but should I do that for like MP's sake?
Sure.
Well, just so you know, the podcast is called Activating Consciousness, and it was the brainchild of someone who's not in the room, and therefore I'm not going to mention him. And the idea of the podcast is to sort of explore all the different ways of being that there are, particularly with regards to how, I guess you could call it personal growth, you could call it consciousness, you could call it like spirituality or anything like that, but how that sort of really changed the way that you view your life and your work. And I think both of you have that, and I certainly do as well, which is why we're here in this conversation. So just to open up, like if you could briefly introduce yourself and give us an idea of your context and your life experience. And we'll start with MP.
Okay, thanks, Sam. My name is Empee, or Marie-Pierre, and I'm from the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations, also territory, also known as Vancouver, British Columbia. And I'm the head refarmer at an organization called Refarmers, and we do small-scale permaculture projects in East Africa and here in Vancouver as well. And yeah, I used to be an eco-clothing designer, and I couldn't find fulfillment in doing that anymore. I couldn't really figure out how to do it less wastefully, even though it was eco-clothing, and it was just, there was no way in producing brand new clothing that I was able to feel comfortable with that, and everything was going well, and things were just, I could have just done that, and I just couldn't anymore. But I started urban gardening in that time, and I really saw what social cohesion, urban farming or urban gardening brought to me in my life. You know, I have a traffic circle garden in the center of the street here, a roundabout, and some cultures call it a roundabout. And so it really allowed me and allows me to meet lots of my neighbors. And I really realized that food growing is the glue that kind of holds communities together, and it has in many different cultures and throughout history, and really feel like that might be the key to being able to affect real change in all kinds of communities. And I don't know how much of an intro you want me to give.
Yeah, that's great. And yeah. Lorraine, yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. And that's so neat to hear, MP. And I actually just want to home in on the traffic circle roundabout thing, because I'm realizing as a little kid, I grew up where there was a roundabout that had a mulberry tree growing in it. And as the berries ripened every year, we would pick the berries, and it was a great thing in the neighborhood. And that was in the middle of Toronto. So, but there's, I guess, I'll depart from your introduction, which I want to have run more, and go to mine. I'm coming to you from Montreal, Quebec, and I am a corporate advisor. I do most of my work as an independent advisor on environmental, social, and governance, or ESG, data and transparency, mostly for large corporations. And that ends up looking like sustainability reporting or investor-oriented communications. And I mostly do that on behalf of an agency that sort of brings me in as one of the horses in their stable. I do some other more direct independent work. I'm doing some ESG coaching with a large forest products company based in Brazil, where I'm kind of helping them think about what is the point of any ESG reporting at all? How will it have any impact? And I'm doing that, and I'll use that to segue into what I really think I need to be doing, which is I'm using that coaching opportunity to talk about ideas like engaging with non-human stakeholders. So what does it look like for a river to benefit from a corporate ESG report? Well, at the moment, that's verging on an absurd question, but it kind of shouldn't be an absurd question. And so how can I contribute to helping, along with billions of others, to reorient global industrial systems so that they heal people and ecosystems. So that's what I do. Most of the time I spend not getting paid to sort of think and explore and have conversations like this, learning from others. And I guess my background after being 6 years old and picking mulberry trees in the roundabout in Toronto, where I grew up, I've had a pretty checkered past, so I'll just quickly pick up a couple things. I worked at World Wildlife Fund, the environmental NGO, straight out of school, where I studied German and religious studies, so obviously highly relevant, actually proving highly relevant more and more every day. And then I worked in electronic engineering in New Zealand, which was a very interesting segue that obviously then segued me into being a handmade paper maker. I was my own little circular economy, taking business waste and turning it into handmade paper products, which was a really clear stepping stone towards working for 3 years as a senior business analyst at Manulife Financial. And that was my last stepping stone before getting into sustainability in the early 2000s, or what I now think of as regeneration. So really dabbled in and out of a lot of different sectors. And all the while, speaking of eco, fashion, MP, I don't know if I would put fashion in what I've been doing, but I've definitely been playing with fabric as a spinner and a knitter for almost my whole life. Right around the mulberry picking time, I was already knitting, and I've been creating yarns and dyeing and weaving and doing all kinds of stuff with fabric throughout that time, just as an artisan, which has informed that work. That's probably more than enough about me for now.
Yeah, more than enough. So then I think what this speaks to, especially with regards to, we've talked about the urban context, especially, where I think is probably where in a country like Canada, which is massive and huge, and there is diversity, but obviously it's within the context that it exists. And so the question then becomes, what is your experience of our civilization of separation? Noting that there are very strong cultural forces, like traditional culture as well as modern culture, that are sort of pulling us apart. And what made you realize that there was something deeply wrong with our dominant human civilization? Like, which point was that for you, and how did that hit? And again, we'll start with MP.
Okay, I guess I pretty much was a traveler for my entire 20s, for the past like 15 years, until now. But basically, out of high school, I went into university not knowing what I was going to do at all. And I lasted 2 months. And because I realized I had a choice, and that was when I kind of, I was 19, and I was like, I had been pressured socially and indoctrinated in so many ways. And I had never considered that I didn't have to go to university. Like, I mean, at least, take a year off, or, I don't know, back then the gap year thing wasn't really happening, but how about not at all? And I realized I learned everything I needed to know through lived experience. And I really traveled my heart out, and I became an emancipated woman, like lone traveler. That was another thing. It was like, how do I go to India and Pakistan by myself? And I traveled for years and years and years and didn't stop. And I had no purpose other than to discover. Like, I went off the beaten track to Tibet, like hitchhiked into Tibet, and did just the craziest things that I probably would never do now. But I learned so much culturally. And when I would come back to Canada, I felt really disconnected because I'd seen other cultures be more coherent, I guess, or just community-based. And I always felt like I didn't belong here. So I would just leave and go travel again. And I went all over the place. But then eventually I started a business, which just one thing led to another. And and then I ended up in Indonesia and Bali making clothing, which was way, way later. And that's where our workshops were. And that's when I also realized what it's like for people to grow up with intergenerationally, and really it's so safe. And like, people, they don't have a culture of alcoholism. Like, there's no alcohol. People just don't need to drink. Like, they don't need to drink away their sorrows or their crazy culture. It's just strange to come back to Canada, where that's how people, chill out. It's just by drinking. And that just is really abnormal to me. And so, but I have a crazy past. So that was also a problem of mine. But going there and seeing that, other cultures like have nothing to do with that. And so then, but now being at home and with the pandemic and really localizing myself in my community, this is the first time in my entire life, even when I I had a store here. I was still going to Bali every winter, and I was just, the traveling was a distraction from my lack of community. And I always felt like I didn't belong here or there, anywhere, but it felt great to travel. So it was like, but being here and really getting to know my neighbors and making, I don't know, and dealing with the stuff that comes up and the privilege and the poverty that exists right here in my neighborhood, and that I'm face to face with it on a daily basis, and I'm not running away from it, and trying to work here in my community has really, I don't even remember the original question now, but why? Yeah. So I guess realizing in myself that that's where the problem was. I was never brought up in a community, you know, even though I come from an extended family in Quebec, and which also has historically been intergenerational, that kind of stopped in my generation. And my mom and I, she was a single mom, we traveled a lot. I went to so many different schools, and that like lack of belonging anywhere, it really carried over. But now it really gave me, showed me how important community is, and that, yeah, you have to cultivate it, and it is possible to cultivate it even if you haven't grown up with it. Anyway.
Is it possible to cultivate it without people knowing that you're cultivating it?
Yeah, I guess, yeah, I think just the being genuinely, like, it comes naturally to me to just want to know people's stories and get to know what made that person become that person, even if the story is just like, not that adventurous, or, you know, I just am so interested in knowing like how that person came to be here and what their story is. And I think if we were all kind of interested in each other in that way, that is what cultivates deeper relationships, and even with strangers. And that's, yeah, having time to do that in a culture where you're always fast going from one thing to the next. You don't have time to sit and talk to your neighbor outside. Like we do that all the time in my building in the city. It's really crazy. The neighbors just congregate because some of us are just generally interested in it. It attracts others into that, like, oh, this is weird. And yeah, I think definitely people get sucked in without knowing that we're cultivating community.
Yeah, I love that. And so the three things that pop up for me are curiosity, humility, and accessibility. And this speaks to, I guess, countering our civilization of separation, in a sense, by having those three things in place. Lorraine, your thoughts on that question?
Yeah, so I love the question and the reflections that you just offered in response to MP. That strikes deeply. I feel like I have a whole deck of cards, and on each card I could play, like, I noticed it here, and then I noticed it here, and, you know, full house, royal flush of noticing disconnection. I'm going to pick on two moments in my life that are a couple decades apart that feel like they're kind of aggregating right now in what I'm seeing and doing. One was in the early 90s. I worked as an industrial tree planter to pay for school. So it's a kind of Canadian thing. Like lots of countries have plantation-based forest products industries. Certainly Brazil, huge. I now work in that industry. Indonesia, Finland, you know, the US, like there's plantation-based forests all over. To my knowledge, this thing of like students strapping bags of trees to their hips and like slogging it out in the craziest conditions you can imagine. And it's like a little bit of a cult, and doing that for the seasons between the frost and the high summer, which is when those seedlings need to go in the ground with the greatest likelihood of surviving. It's kind of a Canadian thing. And so if you bump into other tree planters, it's kind of like, yeah, okay. So anyways, I tree planted, and essentially you're standing in a clear cut. That's the reason you're planting trees. There aren't any. And then the industry needs there to be some in order to harvest them in a few decades' time. And when I first went in, I think I was 19, my first season of tree planting, maybe 20. So I'd traveled, I'd, you know, lived in Brazil, I'd lived in Germany. I was a fairly awake kid. I was very interested in, I went to the Amazon when I lived in Brazil. You know, Sting was singing about the Amazon, Bruce Cockburn in Canada was singing about the Amazon. So I was like awake to deforestation and, let's say, global issues. But it wasn't until I was in a clear cut planting trees for like 10 cents a piece that I realized, here's Canada, this massive, you know, second largest country by land mass in the world, perceived by the outsiders and frankly by the insiders in Canada as a vast wilderness. And you can drive for hours and hours and hours in Northern Ontario, which is where we were planting, and look to the left, look to the right, and you see trees. But if you go a couple hundred yards in, it's clear cut. And so you think that there's forest everywhere. And then actually you realize, no, it's plantation and it's being harvested. And here it's clear cut and there it's grown up a little and there it's grown up a little bit more. It's basically a patchwork of plantation trees for industry. And so being in those clear cuts and by the way, I spent a lot of time as a kid in the forests of Manitoulin Island, which I thought were just natural forests. And now I realize, no, they were once harvested too. Now they're a bit more natural because private landowners have let the trees grow back, but they're all secondary or tertiary forest. So there was this kind of like, oh, like this is how it works. Forest, as we understand it, has already been cut and it's maybe natural, maybe not. There is very, very little old growth forest in Canada, period, the end. And I certainly hadn't seen any old growth at that point. And clear cuts look like war zones. It is a horrible place to be. You are going to be baked by the sun if it's sunny. You are going to be drenched to the bone if it's raining. You will be eaten, kind of literally eaten alive by black flies when it's black fly season. It is ruthless. So that disconnect of like what industry actually does so that we have toilet paper and lumber and printer paper and what people think Canada is was like, oh, okay. Mind you, it was really fun. And we drank a lot, to MP's point about our culture, and I made a lot of money and I paid for school. So then the second episode of putting 2 and 2 together and realizing they really equal about like 14 trillion was in 2019, I think it was June 2019, when the missing murdered Indigenous women and girls report came out in Canada, and that was to sort of investigate and pursue an understanding of the systemic racism and violence against Indigenous women and girls. And the sort of aha for me was, you know, I grew up aware that there were residential schools. I had a very, I thought, and I still think, enlightened grade 7 and 8 primary school teacher who really taught us a lot about racism and prejudice and the need to understand that the land was stolen and that there were First Peoples here, et cetera. My mom's 2 best friends are Anishinaabe, and so I felt like I was like pretty tuned in. And then I realized, like, I don't have a fucking clue. Like, that Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's report described the cultural genocide that took place in the last 30 to 50 years, like on my watch, the years I've been alive. I've been paying taxes to the institution that carried out that racism. And so recognizing like, holy crap, it's so bad. And I thought I'm one of the helpful, enlightened people. And I think I work in industrial regeneration, and I've committed my life to that. That was a really big wake up of disconnect that I thought, okay, if I can experience that at the time I was 48, what else have I not yet woken up to? Like, what outer rungs of awareness of reality are still waiting for me to step into them so that I can connect deeper in myself and then really contribute to what lies ahead? Yeah, those 2 come to mind.
And what this speaks to for me is sort of how at the height of the slave trade, there were people in Europe who were aware of it, but they were very few. And the fact that it's still going on today in a different form, of course, and perpetuated by systems with a different excuse, I think speaks to exactly what you're speaking to right now, Lorraine, which is that we're all ignorant of what we're ignorant of. And unless we approach, right, with a learning mind and also clean eyes, I don't know how else to say it, but without propaganda, right, we're going to be missing it. And so this actually feeds really well into the next question, which is that we are on our own incomplete personal journeys. from sort of, I think everyone has to go through this journey, but it's something, how far you get is something that is unknown, I guess. So point A for me is when we are conforming to and accepting of the dominant civilization today, all of this propaganda we're receiving, we're building into our core identity, and we're then trying to live up to this thing that we're now conforming to. And then, so if that's point A, where we are right now as a like modern human society, and point Z is then becoming the humans that our land actually needs us to be, whatever that land might be. And it doesn't really matter where that land is for you particularly as an individual human, but it's whatever that land needs you to be, which is something that we might call ecosystem culture. Like if we're building a new culture to fit into that, what the land needs for us, or what other people also call a new sort of indigenism. So taking it back to the personal, like, where are you right now? Sort of from A to Z, and it's not, I'm specifically using two different pronunciations of Z and Z to be inclusive. But where are you right now, and how did you get there?
Am I going first? Or yeah. I think, wait, I have to gather my thoughts. Lorraine, do you want to go first?
Sure, yeah, I could try. What's funny, my instinct is to say, actually, even imagining that getting to Z is the project fits within the propagandized colonial worldview. And I, I'm provoking a little because I know, Sam, you're not, that you're using it as a tool to have the conversation. But I feel like even the alphabet is up for grabs right now. And so I imagine that there's a beyond alphabet universe that I don't even know how it functions. Is it numbers? Is it other kinds of equations? Is it a script that I haven't been taught yet? Like the alphabet is just these 26 letters that I have. But noting that I don't know what I don't know and doing my best to sense into how far I may be able to go. I just turned 50. I might live another 50 years. So let's imagine I'm halfway through my lifetime. Let's imagine I can accelerate some elements of the learning and integration, and maybe decelerate in others because they're bigger and harder. I'm gonna assign myself, I'm maybe at about letter B right now. Like I'm in a pretty early phase. And I imagine, because I don't have children of my own, so I don't have a biological legacy, a human biological legacy. I've planted tens of thousands of trees, but they're probably all toilet paper in the sewer by now. But anyway, because I don't have a biological legacy, I imagine it's my opportunity, my obligation, my duty to get as far as I can and then hand off where I get to my nieces and nephews, to my younger peers and colleagues, to people who survived me. So yeah, I give myself a pretty early stage, I guess.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Okay, yeah, I know what I was going to say now. It was like all jumbled. It's so stimulating that, okay, basically, I've been on this journey my whole life, but I didn't realize that I could do something about, like I didn't really fit into like institutionalized learning. I had a hard time, even though I did well in school, it was really hard for me to learn like that. And like retaining the information, it was just, I'm like a hands-on learner. So I went to Catholic school. Like it was just, my mom just did what she could, and like the schools were close by. Like I just didn't really get the type of education that was useful for my type of learning. So, and that's when, so I always like, I thought there was a problem with me, like my whole life. But why didn't I fit in? Why was I so like not getting people? Like I just felt like everybody was on a different plane or something, and I was like, or that I wasn't empowered. Like I always loved that I was different, but I felt like I just can't fit in, like, and that was okay for me, like, because I like relished in that, you know, I was like, cool, I'm an artist, awesome. And I think a lot of artists are kind of like, and there's this amazing quote that I wanted to read, a Krishnamurti quote, which it is no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society. And when I read that, I was like, whoa, because I could never get adjusted. So am I more healthy? You know, and then you look at indigenous cultures, and some cultures like shaman are actually would be people with like mental illness or something. In our culture, they're tapped into something else, like they can't function linearly. Like if you put them in here, they're just going to be crazy people. And there's a documentary about that, like how about shamanism. And anyway, so basically, I feel like I've been on this journey for a long time, but I just didn't, realize that how I could fit. And I guess realizing that actually a lot of people are like this too, but they just like force themselves into like fitting in and you know, the 9 to 5 and the grind, but people are unhappy, you know. And so this goes back to community, and I feel like unearthing people's stories in the garden, pun intended, because we work through food growing, and in Vancouver too, we have a food forest project that we want to unearth people's stories there, and traumas and different, you know, and have culturally appropriate food growing, and how can people really get to know each other in that way, and not through, you know, sort of systems, like the systems ways of forcing us to kind of, so I guess I'm like still in the center of also, in the middle of that learning curve, because I'm learning so much every day. Like it's amazing to think that, and that's why I love this type of interview too, because we're our panel discussion, I don't know what you want to call it, but we're still exploring, like I'm in the total exploration phase, and that it's okay to be vulnerable, like, and express to people that we don't have it all figured out. Nobody does. That's also like a makeup thing, pretend thing, because scientists barely have it figured out even, you know. So to show that you're vulnerable and still learning all the time is really important, to acknowledge that none of us really know anything. Like that's the first thing we should probably acknowledge.
Yeah, and another thing to acknowledge is that there are people who have figured it out, and we killed them.
True.
Like, you know, when you talked about this idea of people with mental illness should be revered as shamans, and that's their role in society, that brings a whole new meaning to human-centered design for me. And it really speaks to how are we designing for the humans that we want to design for, rather than the humans that fit in the system, in a sense. And I think that's probably what my problem is with what we now call human-centered design, particularly in the urban space, because the hierarchy is all wrong, you know, of how we're trying to consider what is most people on top of like who are the marginalized, because we never asked that question. And this is again, like, next question is about our global experience, and how, you know, all three of us here in this room have been living in and broadly traveling in richer nations, as well as former colonial countries. And I think the colonial powers, or the previous colonial powers, are often called developed nations. There's a sense of progress, obviously, that's embedded there, and a sense of what is an advanced culture versus what is not an advanced culture. And so these nations often experience greater systemic privilege, of course, because they designed the systems to be in their favor. And there's a sense of entitlement as well, of course, within these cultures. And this is one way in which global hegemony persists in our minds and in our bodies. I am a product, right, of global hegemony. And what hegemony obviously refers to is a cultural domination that permeates our institutional systems, such as the UN, the World Bank, World Trade Organization, etc. So these are the systems we talk about when we're referring to the system, right? And how it shows up is extractive trade policies and globalized capitalism, etc. So these are like, I'm just describing other ways that we are separated and how these things came about. And the parts of the human world which experience these things are, I call the global north, and it's a metaphorical term, of course. The global north also exists in the global south and vice versa. And you're both born in Canada, have a good amount of life and work experience in the global north as well as the global south. So the question I'd like to kind of frame is around the global north itself. And MP, you've talked about this as well. What do communities have to do with it, right? So how do you personally cultivate these interdependencies that we often operate with anyway by default in the global south? How do you cultivate that? So that goes back to the question, I guess, that I asked before, which is, can you build community amongst people who don't know that that we're building community here? And also, how do you relate that to the land that you're currently on? So I think this question also points to the fact that both of you have exposure to and are learning from Indigenous people who work on the lands that you're on. And I think a lot of these global systems they seem to be far away, but they're really not. They're really right next to you. And they're right next to them, right? These peoples who are trying to heal places. So I guess the question is, how do you feel it is to be working in that space? And also, what are the, I almost want to say, what are the buttons we need to press in order to get other people to see that there is joy in this work as well? Like other people who have moved through A to B, let's say, similarly to yourself where you are. So this is the big question.
Do you want to go for it, MP, or no? Okay. There's so much coming up for me as you ask this, Sam. I'll be really honest and say one of the first things that comes up is I feel really lonely. Like I feel really alone in this work. And then chasing that is like, but actually it's really great and I'm not alone. So let me just talk myself out of the rafters. I feel the loneliness because a little bit like you described, MP, where you were like, even though you were good in school and you could make it work, but it didn't feel quite right. I feel like that's a fractal of like me in my wider culture. It's like I'm speaking English with a Canadian accent. I have friends whom I truly love, and I have a wonderful family, and I, all kinds of things that you could say like boxes checked. But I have felt since I can remember like a fish out of water. And I'm going to say literally, and I don't say it lightly because I'm Pisces, I feel like I'm literally, oh, no way. I feel like, MP's pointing at herself if you're just listening to this. I feel like I have been experiencing a reality that's different from the reality of my peers, and then trying to explain my reality and then being told I'm crazy. And so I say that kind of gently, but I think my friends who've known me for a long time outside of my professional space would agree that I'm weird. So, and a little bit like I could say I'm an artist, except I've been making art and the sort of textiles you see behind, like I've been making kind of unusual stuff for a while, but I'm not an artist. That's not my career, you would say. So the loneliness comes from doing what I can to tell what I think is the truth to friends and family and peers and colleagues and clients who, for whatever reason, aren't in a good position to hear that truth. And then finding that I'm doubting myself, like, well, maybe I'm wrong, or everybody has a truth and everybody's a special snowflake and whatever. But then realizing like, no, there really are things that I think I need to share. And I have a lot of, like, I've had actually very real dreams, like I'm asleep dreaming of like deep empathy with people who experienced as the Holocaust was unfolding, like seeing the smoke from the crematorium and knowing that it was human flesh and like trying to say what they knew and not being believed or not knowing how to say it. And these are just like dreams and assertions. I'm obviously not those people, and that didn't really happen to me. But I sometimes have that very visceral feeling about everything from like the industrial meat industry to how we are on stolen land and how our financial system is designed to extract and harm. So that's the loneliness. But yet, what I do, I'm kind of relentless. Like, I don't want to die. I'm not suicidal. I'm actually super curious. I'm very highly self-motivated, probably to the point of being a bit of a lunatic. And so that takes me down channels. I like follow my nose, like, well, what are those people doing? And how did they do it? And how come it's working? And that's what's led me to be friends with people here in, or just outside of Montreal in Kanesatake and Kahnawake, people who have persevered and survived and by various measures thrived and are doing things that are working really well. And in Brazil, likewise, I've followed my nose. I've been there for work. So I've been, flown there by industry to do projects, if you will. But while there, I've sort of made friends in unusual places and followed my nose to different kinds of businesses and initiatives and farms and people and practices where I see what I interpret to be truly regenerative things happening. And so what gives me hope is partly that that's happening, but then I can act as a kind of human mycelium to spread those rumors, to talk about it, to write about it on my blog, to bring it into a client conversation as a kind of, did you know, or here's an example, or so, yeah, that's, it's not exactly community building. I'd say it's kind of starfishing, like I'm like reaching out in multiple directions, grabbing and bringing in nutrients to stay excited and positive and well, and then spreading things back out. And then also just holding the despair a little bit and saying like, sometimes it's pretty grim, but then I get to talk to you guys and I live in this beautiful place and it's actually also pretty awesome.
That's good, Lorraine. Yeah, pretty much. I realize that the way that I do fit into this grind culture is that I'm really proactive and action oriented. And I'm always wondering, what can we all do like right now to bridge those gaps or do something? And really fundamentally, the reason why everything is chaos in this world is that people can't get along like at all. So how can we get along? Basically, I'm like conducting a social experiment just in my neighborhood because this is where I am and this is where I can perform these actions. Like, it's like people talk a lot, and it's like what we're doing now, and there's all these think tanks and just people dreaming and thinking and visioning, and what can you really do right now? Like, talk to your neighbor. Do you know, like in a big city like Vancouver or whatever, like do you know your neighbors' names? Like, this is a crazy thing that is so micro and something that really has deep like impacts and ripple effects in everybody's lives. And it's just a small thing that people could do. So, and in Vancouver here where I live, there's a huge Indigenous population that are not all from here. And how can we become friends? How can we build trusting relationships? And coming from like a white settler, it's not always welcome. I went about it the wrong way, maybe at the beginnings. I'm really eager, enthusiastic, and I travel and I'm like, just want to be everybody's friend, but seeing like people's boundaries, and also in cities, creating spaces where those interactions can happen, which with the traffic circle garden, I have a seed library in there. That actually has become a little hub of like people meeting in a distanced way because it's the pandemic. I've met a bunch of my Indigenous neighbors there too, and just first of all, saying hello to people and just like seeing them over and over again, and like being outside. Like, I'm always shocked at how little people are outside. And of course it's cold and it's really rainy here, but people just don't spend lots of time outside like they do in tropical countries where I've lived. And that's another factor, how to be outside a lot, because that's where you're going to meet the people. And there's just so many small things that you can do that really you don't realize would have such impact. And also getting out of that mindset, which is another colonized mindset of like everything that you do, or, you know, I've had this indoctrinated idea of like having to do something that will have impact and will really make a change, or why would I make an effort to do something that won't, you know, create some kind of change? Or that's like a really weird thing, like about just, you know, making a new friend or spend, you know, I would think like it's wasting time if I spend time with a neighbor outside, like just talking, and it's just like wasting my time. I got to be doing this other productive stuff. And like all those things, like with the beginning of the pandemic actually changed because life slowed down. People weren't going, I wasn't, you know, actually I started our organization Refarmers right at the beginning of the pandemic. And I had this, you know, the desire to succeed, or the pressure that I had, this colonized pressure to succeed, was like lifted. And I was like, wow, I can use this as an excuse to like not, you know, have all the things that I had planned for Refarmers were kind of like, and I was like, this is amazing, cool. Now I can just like chill out. And that's when I started the seed library, and I can just like do things because I like, and those were the things that had these great impacts, and I didn't plan them. I did them out of love and just intention, and didn't care about it having this great impact, and they did. And our projects in Uganda, I did a whole talk about, you know, this kind of idea. So it's really encouraging, and being able to lift yourself out. And the more you surround yourself with different cultures and our Indigenous nations here, and seeing that, yeah, it's not all linear and it's not all time oriented, and that really is refreshing, and we need it. And the fact that we don't use this Indigenous lens for everything we do, like unlike Lorraine, I grew up not knowing an Indigenous person ever until I was like 25, and not learning anything in school. And I'm just like, what? That is, so after that, I kind of like made up for it by like, you know, well, now in my work, I'm like, how could we not use an Indigenous lens to look at everything, because we're on stolen land, you know, and I'm doing work in a public park, and I just, that injustice that, you know, we have to ask park board and city council to do a project in a park. I'm just like, and anyway, it's just, but using that lens for all my work. And also I'm still new at it, and I'm still cultivating new relationships with my Indigenous friends, and not everybody, you know, a lot of people have been stolen from their own cultures, and they're, you know, rooting themselves in their cultures too. And so it's kind of a journey for all of us, and being accepting that, you know, and to get like you're going to get things wrong too, and sometimes addressing other cultures and being forgiving. And that's one thing too, like forgiving each other for being ignorant. And like, it's just really important to not have that hatred that we have for people just not getting it. Like I fight that. I recalibrate on a minutely basis. I have to, and it's important to be recalibrating all the time, and so that you can try to get along.
Sam, can I just build on something there super quick? So it's two things, but they're connected. So first of all, MP, when you introduced yourself and you said where you were, you referenced the territorial community, the nation's land that you're on. And I have a lot of respect for that, and your sort of ability to rattle it off the tip of your tongue. And in juxtaposition to that, I don't do that, because although I respect that you do it, because I feel like there's this habit that's happening in Canada to begin meetings acknowledging with a land acknowledgement. And what I've started to feel now, I haven't been at an in-person meeting in Montreal for a while, but when I first moved here about 2 years ago, and I was attending meetings, having lived in New York, moved here, and the meeting would go like this. I'd like to begin by saying we're on, and they would, you know, rattle off a bunch of Mohawk terms to describe where we are in this part of the world. And, you know, blah, 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 acknowledging that essentially this is unceded, stolen land. Okay, so our first agenda point today is, and then they would just like go into the meeting. And so it's like, wait, can we just go back to the land acknowledgement? Because we aren't doing anything other than saying that the land was stolen. And so I kind of sit in a paradox of like, so, but it is, and so I should acknowledge it, but saying where I am, and I haven't landed. So I totally respect how you do that. And then I'm confused about my own doing that. And then to your impact point, I've recently been having some uncomfortable, let's say, conversations. In my mind, they're arguments, but the other party isn't even arguing, but the concept of scale. And there's this like trend in regeneration of these tech folks, right? And with respect, I'm going to say they're all male. And then a lot of them are like American California, or in this case, there's a particular Nordic streak where they're like, we just need to get the right technology in place and scale it. And I've come to cringe at the word scale. And even a really great solution, I'm starting to argue like, yeah, we shouldn't scale it. And what I'm looking for, and you mentioned it, MP, and it just struck so deeply. I feel like what we're trying to do is increase love. And so if I can increase love between me and my neighbors, me and my one neighbor, and if that has the impact of like making us have more love in our life, whatever that means, because the seeds grew, because the garbage got taken out, like I think that is success. And then more of that is more success. And then to be like, well, how would you scale that? I'm like, I don't know. But if we don't even know what love is, then we're measuring things that shouldn't be measured. And yeah, so anyway, I just wanted to really underscore it's not about having an impact streak. And that has been so pounded into us that as a result, we're not having an impact, like we're having the wrong impact. So yeah, enough.
Yep, go for it, MP.
I was going to say, yeah, and the people who you meet, on the street and can be the CEO of like, some large company that just your interaction with that person could have way deeper ripple effects than you might imagine. And even if people live in rural areas, like you never know who you're meeting and who, and all of the industrialized world is made up of people. Like these things don't run by themselves. Like it's about people. It just looks like, the facade is like, corporations, but who's there? Like these are people that exist in our day-to-day lives. And yeah, how do we, it's so complex, and it's not, I don't know if anything's going to really change in our lifetime, but that's not the point either. Like and the scaling thing, I use scale down to describe what we're doing because people understand the word scale, but even that, so I'm like, scale it down, like I don't even think regeneration and scaling up go together at all, because even when you look at Indigenous cultures and like on the Pacific Northwest, they were Indigenous folks were gardeners essentially, because but it looked kind of like farming in a way because they took up large pieces of land, but they were all like little micro gardens. And this is what we have to kind of cultivate, like little, like that's replicating. It technically would be like scaling, but it's like do little micro things and then replicate that all over the place, because the more you expand and the more people are involved, the more disconnected we are. So you just have like small groups of folks. It's hard to explain, but kind of what I mean. Yeah,
and I think speaking to the power of local community, right? And both in terms of the human aspect and in terms of the environmental aspect, I think is something that we retain here in the global South. But again, there's this like overhanging the system, sort of preventing a lot of communities from being able to really do the natural thing that they want to do, simply because I need money to survive and I need to earn money. That's sort of, I guess, the major way that particularly happens, that people then feel forced to go and make choices that uproot them or separate them, etc. I like this metaphor that Lorraine was using about the starfish, and I took it to a different place, which is that we are kind of like the starfish, where we are blind. and we have little feet, and we are trying to climb this like gigantic coral. And we don't really know what it looks like or how big it is, or what dangers might be around that might stop us from being able to go this way or that way, or anything like that. And also it's going to take a long time because we have little feet.
I love it. Can I give the starfish another dimension too? So
Yeah.
And looping back to the shaman comment as well, I'm very blessed that one of the people who guides me in my life, she's a sort of reformed Freudian analyst become shaman based in Brazil. And you could also just say she's my therapist, but she's so much more than that. And one day she was guiding me through a meditation, and it's a long story, but at the end, I realized that the creature that had been guiding me was a starfish. And it was super random. I don't know if I've ever actually met a starfish, but the starfish just came up. And she said, oh, well, that makes a lot of sense because this meditation was about connecting with all of the elements. And I was like, oh, I thought there were 4 elements, air, water, earth, and fire. And she said, oh, well, in this tradition, we would have a 5th, which is spirituality, or the essence, or the sort of one that wraps around. And so the starfish, the meditation was really based on recognizing that we all have everything we need. And so we are of those elements. We have all 5 of those elements. So little feet, don't have a clue where we're going. Things are going to take time, but we have everything that we need.
Yeah. Final thoughts, MP.
I was going to say something and I forgot. Sorry. In relation to that we have. Yeah, we just have to be patient, basically, and not, I know my friend Lori Snyder, who's a Métis herbalist and works with plant medicine. She always, I don't know why this reminded me of it, but she says you carry your medicine with you because your breath has really the power to heal and that recalibration I was talking about. And it's amazing what this thing that we do all the time, not consciously. And that's why so many Eastern religions and other cultures focus on breath. That is like the life essence. And she says you carry your medicine with you, and whenever we need to, and that really helps with slowing down and pausing, and especially in situations where you're talking with somebody who's not on the same wavelength, or it's really important to tap into that medicine and really cultivate those relationships. I guess that's my last thought.
Cheers. Thank you both for this amazing conversation. I feel really lucky to be part of it, but also the gaps that we bridge, right? And that's the work. That's the work. That's the work. That's the work. So cheers, and I will stop the recording here just now. Yes, I do want to.